Hi friends, welcome back to chapter 17, Methods of Persuasion. I wanted to start out this presentation with a brief quote, and that reads, "If you just communicate, you can get by. But if you communicate skillfully, you can work miracles." And so, again, through this course, we've been learning how to harness the power of our communication to exchange ideas through communication, public speaking. So in this chapter, we will focus on building credibility. So we'll look at the factors that contribute to formulating or developing our credibility, the different types of credibility, and different methods we can employ to establish credibility. We'll briefly talk about using evidence to support our persuasive speeches, and then also reasoning. So we'll look at specific to generalized forms of reasoning. We'll look at generalized to specific forms, causal reasoning, not casual reasoning, causal reasoning, analogical reasoning, and fallacies. Errors in reasoning. So what makes a persuasive speaker? What makes you someone who's persuasive? Listeners will be persuaded by a speaker for one or more of the following reasons. So the first reason is because the audience members believes you to have high credibility. So you are someone who is trustworthy. And that's the reason why they are persuaded. It could be because they have been won over by the speaker's evidence, or not necessarily won over, but they've been persuaded by the evidence that you put forth in your speech. Sometimes speakers or audience members are persuaded because they are convinced by the speaker's reasoning, the logic, the reason that they used. And then the fourth one is because their emotions are touched by the speaker's ideas or language. So there's up to this point, the leading kind of trend in thought in terms of humans is that we are natural storytelling beings. So, oftentimes that's why we emphasize the narratives in our speeches, is because as humans, we pay more attention to narratives and stories than we do with just factual, decontextualized facts. We want to see how those facts, that evidence, plays out in our lives. And so, weaving those into a narrative tends to be a better approach at persuasion. So what are some of the factors of credibility? And credibility includes things such as sociability, physical attractiveness, perceived similarities. These are some things that factor into credibility, but at the essence of credibility is someone who is trustworthy and someone who is of good moral character. So we could look at two factors that are the strongest predictors to credibility, and that is someone's level of competence. So this is essentially how the audience regards the speakers in terms of their intelligence, their expertise, and their knowledge of a subject. So as a speaker, people are going to perceive you as credible based on your level of intelligence, your experiences that you're bringing into the speech, or your knowledge of a particular topic. So if I were to walk in and try teaching a math course, like the most basic math course that you could take in college, like obviously I probably wouldn't be very competent at that, because that is, not my formal training. Now, I have taken, math courses. I know how to do basic, super basic, statistical analyses. You know, but using a computer program to do all the calculations. So obviously, if I'm going to give a speech on, the appropriate statistical analysis to run on, maybe some sort of data, maybe I wouldn't be as credible. And so that would require me to, learn more about the subject, or really try to establish my credibility with the audience. It also could include character. So competence is, your intelligence, your expertise, your knowledge, but then people are going to perceive you as credible based on your character. And this could relate to sincerity. Are you sincere about the topic, the presentation that you're giving? Trustworthiness. Does the audience perceive you as someone that they can trust? And then also, do they perceive that you have concern for their well-being, right? No one wants to be manipulated. No one wants to be duped or tricked into thinking or doing something. And as audience members, they're very in tune to behaviors or different modes of persuasion, and that could be off-putting for them. And so people are going to judge us as speakers based on our competence, but also our character as well. So there are different types of credibility. So the common trend in public speaking and speech making, there are three types of credibility that are more pertinent to us, and that's internal, or the initial credibility, the derived credibility, and the terminal credibility. So essentially, the initial credibility is the credibility of a speaker before they start speaking. And so a couple years ago, I did some training where the chief of police in Riverside gave a presentation, led this hour-long workshop on how to respond to crisis situations on campus. And so I figured, chief of police, right? This person has a lot of credibility, a lot of expertise coming into this workshop. And that's why I signed up to do it, because I'm like, what, better teacher to teach us about how to respond to crisis situations than the chief of police, right? So I'll get back to that training program. The derived credibility, this is the credibility of the speaker as it's produced by everything the speaker does or says during the speech. So everything that you do or say in a speech is going to influence the audience's perceptions of your credibility. And then terminal credibility is the credibility of the speaker at the end of the speech. So I mentioned, when I signed up for that training program, I did that because, again, I perceived, the chief of police and their staff to be highly credible individuals to lead this. However, everything that the person did during the workshop, everything from the technology didn't work, from not knowing how to handle that situation confidently, turning their back to the audience, and trying to present a PowerPoint, be I don't want to stare at your back. I want to see your face. I want to see you engaged, right? And so, essentially what I'm trying to get at is that the initial credibility was extremely high for me for these individuals, but based on what they did during that workshop, my perceptions of their credibility significantly decreased. And at the end of that workshop, I felt like it was a waste of time and it wasn't professional. And again, I walked away with this negative perception of these individuals. Obviously, they had the credibility. They knew what they were talking about. They were, they're professionals, but the way that they engaged with their audience turned me off, and I wasn't really fully engaged in that. So as a speaker, you have to be careful of, again, everything that you do or say in a presentation, because that could damage your credibility as a speaker. So how do we enhance our credibility or build credibility? Well, as we talked about, trustworthiness, expertise, and goodwill towards the audience, all of these things factor into the credibility. So some things that you want to do is first explain your competence. Not everyone in your audience is going to understand the type of experiences or knowledge that you're bringing into the speech. So explain your competence, stress research, stress your special knowledge about a particular topic. Try to weave in narratives or personal examples into your speech that communicates that competence. Try to establish common ground. People aren't persuaded by being told what to do, or by being told that they're inferior, or by being told that they're wrong. Like oftentimes when someone says, you know what, Colin, like you're wrong, or your thinking sucks, like my defenses go up and I'm just like, I tune those people out. But I listen to people who establish common ground, who establish rapport, and try to, elevate me to a new level. These are the people that I allow to persuade me. And so really, if you're trying to persuade an audience, you have to establish that common ground. So establish that common ground and show respect for your audience. As the saying goes, you catch more flies with honey than with vinegar. Like you aren't here to completely destroy, your audience. Like you want to build a relationship with them so that you can invite them into your side of the argument, or invite them to see things from your point of view. And then also good delivery. So I mentioned, previously in the previous slide, that delivery, everything that you do or say has an impact on your credibility. So you want to make sure that you practice your delivery. You want to deliver that speech fluently, expressively, and with conviction. Okay, so let's go ahead and get more into the theoretical aspect of persuasion. So Petty and Cacioppo developed this theory, elaborate likelihood theory. We call it like a model because they proposed a model, but it is a theory. So some of the theoretical assumptions based on elaborate likelihood theory is the following. When a persuader presents information, the audience react by using either one of two channels and sometimes both. So when you're presented a persuasive message, you're either going to use the central processing route, which involves a high level of elaboration focused on the logical elements of that argument. So oftentimes we use the central processing route when there's a high level of motivation to pick apart or to pay attention to the message. Also, there is a high level of careful and thoughtful consideration of the arguments. Again, because the arguments pertain to us maybe on a personal level. And so we are going to be more critical, pay more attention, essentially putting in more elaborative thinking or cognitive work into trying to understand the situation. And so that's that last point right there in the central processing route, high level of cognitive processing. So if you're really passionate about climate change and someone gives a speech, a persuasive speech on climate change, chances are you're going to be more emotionally invested in what they're saying because that issue is maybe really important to you. And so you're going to be motivated to critically assess that information. You're probably listening to this presentation because, your grade at the end of the semester is contingent on, how well you do in the class and, retain the information and use this information in your speeches. And so because of that, you're going to probably be, highly motivated to, pay more attention. However, we aren't always like that. And so the theorist recognize that there is a peripheral route of processing information. This involves low levels of elaboration, and it typically is focused on general impressions. And so if you are not necessarily super passionate about climate change, or that's an issue that you don't really care about, then you're going to probably use low motivation. You're going to probably feel less motivated to pay attention. There's going to be a low level of careful and thoughtful consideration to the arguments. And consequently, because we aren't putting in a lot of cognitive effort into trying to understand or track the logic and the reason that's being presented to us, then that typically we rely on emotional appeals or our moods to feel persuaded. But when we are persuaded based on our moods or our emotions, that doesn't lead to sustainable long-term change. And so, there's a lot of other theories and a lot of other scholarship that looks at how we can balance these two. But in the introduction of the speech, we want to try to get the audience to be operating from the central processing route. And we do that through the significance statement. We try making a connection between the topic that we're presenting on and how it, significantly makes an impact in the audience's lives. So here is the diagram. So if you're a visual learner, this will maybe help explain what I just told you. So we have a persuasive message, and we could use either the central or processing route. So you're going to give your speech. Your audience, they might be highly motivated to pay attention to your speech based off of the topic. So they're going to be motivated. They're going to be analytical. They're going to be picking apart your arguments. The thing is, they're going to be using a lot of processing power to be able to do that because they're invested. So there's high effort in evaluating the message, right? And then if you're successful at persuading the audience, that's going to lead to this lasting change in attitude. However, your audience also might not be motivated. They aren't going to be super analytical. Consequently, they're going to be putting in minimal effort into evaluating your message. And they're going to be more concerned about maybe cues outside of the message. How well you dressed or how well you presented your argument. Did you use, language that they could understand? How did you make them feel? Sitting there listening to your speech. So they're going to be persuaded by kind of those factors. And if they are persuaded, then that leads to temporary change in attitude. So we know that, again, persuasion is really difficult. So, as this whole class, I really stress the importance of using evidence and backing up our information with references, using oral citations in our speech, because again, that is one way we can establish credibility. And so how do we use evidence? We could use all sorts of different types of evidence. We could use statistical data. We could use examples. We could use people's personal testimonies. So when we use various types of evidence, it's really important to accurately cite them within our speeches in order to establish that credibility. And so you don't want to just pull, random information from somewhere and say, oh, blah, 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 right? So here's an example of what not to say. A lot of people suffer from hearing loss. Great. Well, not great. It's tragic that people are, suffer from hearing loss. But, by just stating that, it doesn't give us enough information, doesn't enhance our credibility. But if you were to say, according to the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, 31 million Americans have some degree of hearing loss, right? So there you go. that is a much complete, credible statement, right? And it's factual. I'm establishing the facts that, based on the CDC and the data and the research they've collected, 31 million Americans have some sort of hearing loss, right? So you want to use novel and credible evidence. So, you know, when you're citing evidence or using some sort of evidence in your speeches for this class, anything related to academic research is going to be highly credible, and anything that's non-biased. So if you are using news reports, you want to make sure you understand the political leaning of that newspaper or maybe that news source, because there's a lot of bias in the news. In fact, one of my last research projects that I worked on explored media bias and how they frame news in a particular light in order to give a slant to the interpretation. So we know that as academics that, again, if you're going to be using, news sources which have traditionally been non-biased, they aren't anymore. So if you're going to use one news source from one source, try to balance it with another news source. So let's jump into types of reasoning. There are two specific, two categories, I guess, we're going to look at. The first one is reasoning from specific instances. So this is progressing from a number of particular facts in order to generate a general conclusion. The second type is reasoning from general principles. So progressing from general principles to a specific conclusion. So let's take a look at that first one, reasoning from specific instances. And again, this is where we're using particular, facts to generate a general conclusion. So, we could use fact one: President Obama supported the American Recovery and Investment Act and allotted, $5 billion dollars for early learning programs. So, there's a specific instance. The second specific instance: President Obama launched the Education to Innovate campaign to enhance American students' performance in key areas of science and math. Fact three, right? So there's another specific instance. President Obama endorsed the Healthcare and Education Reconciliation Act to invest more in higher education programs like community college. So then comes our conclusion. President Obama, values education, right? So again, this is just an example to show you how someone could use, very specific instances to lead to a general conclusion. So, here's another example. You could say something like, fact one: I've researched several articles and resources on blood donation. Fact two: I have personally donated blood for the past 3 years. Fact three: I sit with my grandma through her weekly dialysis appointment, so I know, what that process looks like. Conclusion: I'm credible to talk about the topic of blood donation and how it impacts people's lives. So I'm using, again, in this example, a lot of different specific instances to lead to that general conclusion. So here are some things we want to look out for when we use reasoning from specific instances. We want to avoid hasty generalizations. So this is essentially using insufficient specific instances to generate the general conclusion. So there's, what you state as examples or, evidence might not support the general conclusion. And so we want to avoid making hasty generalizations. So here's an example. The American Medical Association states that men with bald spots have 3 times the risk of heart attacks as men with full head of hair. Therefore, balding causes heart attacks, right? You can see the error in that reasoning. Just because someone's going bald doesn't make them 3 times at risk of, a heart attack. So be careful with wording. Avoid absolutes. Balding always causes heart attack. So absolutes are always, never, those non-negotiable terms. So let's go ahead and jump into reasoning from principle. This is where, again, we're progressing from general principles to a specific conclusion. So, the classic example from Aristotle is, using this general principle to the minor premise to the conclusion. So we could see all fruit has seeds. Apples have seeds. Therefore, all apples are fruit, right? So this is again, where we're using a general principle, the minor principle, and then a conclusion. So here's the general principle. The Children's Miracle Network funds hundreds of hospitals that offer care specifically to children. The minor premise is kind of like the example. So our minor premise here is Sarah has been a patient at a Children's Miracle Network hospital for over 6 months. And then conclusion, your donation to the Children's Miracle Network could benefit children just like Sarah, right? So let's go ahead and move on to causal reasoning. This is where we try to establish a relationship between cause and effect things. So here's the cause. Hurricane Harvey produced record-breaking rainfall. The effect, the large volume of rain increased river levels, which ultimately led to the flooding of Houston. So this was a couple years ago when Houston was totally flooded out because, again, they had a record-breaking rainfall. And that large volume of rain increased river levels, which ultimately led to Houston flooding. But we have to keep a lookout for things that within this causal reasoning that might damage our argument. So things that you want to keep out or keep a lookout for. The first one is don't assume that events only have one cause. So even though that we're maybe trying to argue for a specific cause of an event, keep in mind that there are multiple factors that play into the cause of an event. So continuing on our example of Houston flooding, this example was taken from David Shaper. So according to David Shaper, a national news reporter states that urban planners and civil engineers say a combination of natural and man-made factors has created a chronic drainage problem that left the city especially vulnerable to Harvey's torrential rains. So essentially, it was a combination of, yes, an increase, or record-breaking rainfall that season, but a big problem too that contributed to Houston flooding was that the drainage system, the urban planners, the civil engineers that worked on the draining, it was outdated. Like it wasn't effective. So, here's another example. Obesity rates in America are alarmingly high, so there's an effect. Studies have shown that the lack of exercise contributes greatly to the problem of obesity, right? So, again, is that the only thing that is causing, the obesity rates in America to increase? Is it just the lack of exercise? No, it's probably a lot of other factors as well, too. Let's go ahead and jump into analogical reasoning. This is where essentially we compare two similar cases and assume that what is true for one should be true for the other. So it's like kind of this cross-comparative analysis between two similar cases in which we're trying to make that relationship or justify. So again, here's an example. If you enjoyed watching the first 7 Harry Potter movies, chances are you will enjoy the final Harry Potter movie, right? What to look out for when we do analogical reasoning. Make sure that the two cases are in fact similar. So, you don't want to use two completely irrelevant cases and trying to make an argument that, they support each other. So here's a case, a study done in the University of Iowa surveying 1,500 college students found that 80% of students will take out student loan sometime through their time as an undergraduate. So 80% of students, from this sample population are going to be taking out student loans. Case 2, this means that in this room, it is probable that at least 16 of you will be facing student loan debt upon, graduation. So I'm using, again, that analogical reasoning. So lastly, let's take a look at fallacies. This is essentially an error in reasoning. So as a speaker, we want to avoid fallacies in our speeches because it damages our credibility. It makes us look really bad. And again, it communicates to the audience that we can't be trusted, or whatever we say is just one big error. As an audience, we have to be alert to fallacies in speeches because these happen all the time, and if we aren't in tune or if we don't know what's going on, we might be persuaded based off of irrational, erroneous type of reasoning. So some of the most common fallacies, I know the slide is small, like the print, because there's a lot of them. There's 7. The first one is red herring. This is a fallacy that introduces an irrelevant issue to divert the attention away from the subject. Ad hominems, a fallacy that attacks the person rather than dealing with the real issue in dispute. Either or, this is a fallacy that forces listeners to choose between 2 alternatives when more than 2 alternatives exist. Bandwagon, a fallacy that assumes that because something is popular, it is therefore good, correct, or desirable. So everyone's jumping on the bandwagon, with all sorts of things in popular culture or mainstream media. The slippery slope, a fallacy that assumes that taking a first step will lead to subsequent steps that cannot be prevented, right? And so we often see this taking place in, again, mainstream media, where it's like, well, if you try to put in this regulation, then what else are they going to try regulating, right? Slippery slope. Hasty generalizations, again, we kind of talked about this. This is an error in reasoning from specific instances in which a speaker jumps to the general conclusion on the basis of insufficient evidence, right? So, again, we might see that listening to angry music or playing, violent video games will corrupt someone and lead them to, act out, the violence they are exposed to in video games in real life, right? So we want to be careful of this, of these hasty generalizations, and that's why, again, we always support our arguments with empirical research, with statistics, with, examples and so forth, case studies. And then false cause. This is an error in causal reasoning in which a speaker mistakenly assumes that because one event followed another, the first event is the cause of the second. This error is often known by its Latin name post hoc, ergo propter hoc, meaning that after this, therefore because of this. So again, just because something seems to correlate, if there's a correlation between a cause and event, it doesn't necessarily mean that cause actually contributed to it. So again, lack of exercise is just one factor in the rising obesity rates in America, right? Access to, crappy food, in like fast food, right? Deregulation on, the stuff that they put into the food we get at the supermarket, right? It could be maybe because entertainment is so accessible, we don't even have to leave our houses, Amazon, like we can shop online. So yeah, lack of exercise, but there's all sorts of different things that are contributing to that. Like lack of exercise, maybe our lack of immobility stems from, the internet, or having, all these services to be able to go out, or to bring up our phone and Grubhub and have someone else deliver fast food to us, and what's in that fast food that is contributing to this. So there's a lot of different ways we could look at this, right? So again, depending on the approach of your speech, what you're trying to argue for, you want to be careful of these fallacies. So I know I really went through this really quickly. I'm trying to keep these short, but essentially in this chapter, in this lecture, we covered building credibility. We talked about the factors, the types, and the methods. We talked a little bit about using evidence, and also some of the reasoning process. So make sure that you read thoroughly and fully the content in the textbook to get a detailed explanation of the different methods of persuasion. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you next time.